My husband texted me from Bali. Sold our beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with my personal trainer. Enjoy being homeless lol. I simply replied, check your account balance. When he finally did, homeless lol? She asked in disbelief, her voice thick with frustration. How can he be so cold, Mom? I paused for a moment, collecting myself before responding. He thinks it's a game, Elise. It's just so typical of him, shallow and self-serving to the end. Thomas was quieter, deep in thought, swirling the wine in his glass. So what's next? Do we just wait for him to come back for the hearing? Essentially, yes, I replied. But I'm not waiting passively. I've got everything under control. The court's protective orders are solid, and I'm stepping into this moment with care. Francis has been careful all these years, but now he's realized he's only backed into a corner I created. His whims and demands can no longer determine the course of our lives. Elise raised an eyebrow, her usual air of uncertainty replaced with a mix of awe and disbelief. You really have everything handled, don't you, Mom? Clearing my throat, I nodded. I do. But remember, this isn't just about taking everything back from him. It's about protecting our future, our savings, and ensuring he can't harm any more of our lives. The next few days were full of legal preparations and heated back-and-forth communication through lawyers. But despite the emotional toll, I felt more empowered than I ever had in my entire 52 years. I wasn't taking back a beach house or titles or material possessions. I was reclaiming my future, my dignity, and my sense of self. And then, on the day of our court hearing, the inevitable happened. Francis returned, not with his usual bravado, not with a cool smile, but with a mess of disheveled shame. Despite everything, his arrogance, his betrayals, his plans to elude the consequences, he stood helpless in the courtroom. It was his final attempt at redemption or control, but it was too late, and I saw that look in his eyes, the once confident and unshakable man now realizing the weight of his own decisions. I'm sorry, he muttered after a long stare down at the evidence presented before him. His voice seemed distant and defeated. You should have been, I replied flatly, my own voice steady and unwavering. You lied, cheated, and thought you could get away with it. You're not sorry for me. You're sorry because you're losing. There's a difference. Suddenly, I realized something I hadn't known before. The emptier he became, the better I understood my own fullness. So here I am today, standing on the edge of the life I've only dreamed of. The challenges behind me, confronting betrayal, navigating deceit, building the case, even while trying to maintain minimal emotional scars, were necessary battles in my journey. Looking out at the ocean of possibilities, I'm finally free in ways I never thought I could be. Might there still be hurdles ahead? Yes, I suspect there will be. But I am no longer the woman expected to satisfy everyone, fix everything, or bend under pressure. I'm stronger now. And when the time arrived, I learned to look back at that text, the one that once sharply rejected me, and feel genuine pride. I'm not homeless. I am free. 4:22 seconds. My husband's text woke me at 3:17 a.m. in our Boston brownstone. The blue light of my phone revealed his message from Bali. Sold our Cape Cod beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless lol. Don't bother calling, changing my number tomorrow. After 30 years of marriage, that was his goodbye, punctuated with a mocking lol. I simply replied, check your account balance. My name is Alice Mercer, and at 52 I never imagined starting over like this. For 3 decades, Francis and I had built a life together, saved for retirement, and planned for our children's future. Yet, over the past few months, subtle clues had pointed to something amiss. It began last spring when Francis suddenly took an intense interest in fitness. After years of dismissing my gentle suggestions to get regular health checkups, he enrolled in an exclusive gym and started disappearing for 2-hour training sessions 3 times a week. By summer, he was at the gym almost daily and had lost 30 pounds. Whenever I mentioned the mounting credit card charges, he'd snap, "You should be happy for me. I'm finally taking care of myself." Then came the password changes on our financial accounts, secretive phone calls, and business trips that suspiciously coincided with Jessica's Instagram posts from far-flung locations. I'm not naturally confrontational, but as a hospital administrator, I've built my career on careful observation, documentation, and strategic planning. So instead of confronting him head-on, I began gathering evidence, taking notes, photographing statements, and consulting professionals. When Francis mentioned a solo wellness retreat in Bali, I knew it was time to act. I typed that simple message, check your account balance. I could already picture him lounging in a luxury villa with Jessica, smugly assuming his plan had worked flawlessly. But I had already filed for an emergency asset protection order 3 weeks earlier. That order froze our joint assets, and any transfers would be intercepted and held in a court-monitored account. I spent the next few months building a meticulous timeline. It began with credit card statements. Francis had always prided himself on being careful with money, yet suddenly he was spending $500 weekly at Elite Training Solutions without discussion. Then came the random cash withdrawals, $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Each amount carefully chosen to avoid triggering bank notifications. I quietly consulted our family attorney, Diane, who urged me to document everything. I photographed financial statements, recorded unusual withdrawal dates, and copied our property deeds. I even hired a forensic accountant who discovered that, 3 months earlier, Francis had opened a secret bank account. The most damning evidence came from draft emails to a real estate agent discussing a quiet listing of our family's cherished beach house. a property that had been in our family for generations. The turning point arrived when I overheard a hushed conversation. I had come home early with a migraine, and while resting in our bedroom, I heard Francis in his office, speaking in that intimate tone he once reserved for me. "Jessica, baby, it's all coming together. The beach house will sell quickly, and once that money hits our account, I'll transfer everything to the offshore account we set up. By the time she figures it out, we'll be living the dream in Bali." I sat perfectly still, shock mingling with a deep resolve. That night, I took every piece of evidence to Judge Martinez, a seasoned judge who'd seen his share of marital betrayals and financial deceptions. The emergency asset protection order was granted immediately, placing our joint assets under strict court supervision. The next day, as our children Thomas and Elise would soon learn from my careful explanation, I received a notification from our banking app. An international IP address was attempting to access our account. Francis was finally checking his balance. About 15 minutes later, his number lit up my screen again. He hadn't changed it yet. I let it ring several times until I answered. "Alice, what the hell did you do?" His voice was a mix of rage and panic, the sound of his carefully constructed paradise beginning to crumble. "Good morning, Francis," I replied calmly. "I see you checked your accounts. This is our money." He shouted back. "You had no right. Our 30-year marriage money is mine to use." I corrected him. "Our money. Money we saved together for retirement and our children's future." "I'll fight this," he threatened, his voice lowering to a harsh whisper. I could almost picture him stepping away from Jessica, trying to hide the disaster unfolding on his end. "You won't get away with it. I've already protected what's legally mine," I said. Judge Martinez had been particularly interested in the recorded conversation where he casually mentioned leaving Alice with nothing while we live it up in Bali. The court order had even voided the beach house sale. The buyer's attorney confirmed they'd been understanding once they received the order. A muffled argument erupted in the background. I heard a female voice, Jessica's, growing agitated. "Is that Jessica?" I asked. "You might want to know the offshore account you set up has been frozen, and authorities have been notified about potential tax evasion. Also, we've been monitoring your activity." Desperation replaced his anger as Francis stammered. "No, I've been protecting myself from your calculated betrayal." "There's a difference," I replied, my tone icy. "By the way, the children know everything. They've seen the evidence and read your texts." Over the next 48 hours, it was like watching a slow-motion car crash from a safe distance. Francis tried calling 17 more times. I answered only once more to insist that all future communication go through our attorneys. I forwarded his calls to Diane's office, where every attempt was documented. That evening, Francis's brother Michael arrived at my house, bringing legal expertise and moral support. He spread out all the documents on our dining room table. "Alice, you did everything exactly right. The evidence is overwhelming, and the judge's protective orders are solid. What do you think we should do next?" he asked over coffee. Michael sighed. If he were thinking clearly, he'd be on the next flight home trying to salvage what he can. But Francis always doubles down when cornered. As if on cue, an email notification popped up. It was from Jessica. The subject line read, "Mrs. Mercer." In formal language she wrote, "I feel I should inform you that Francis misrepresented his financial situation to me. He claimed the beach house was his alone, an inheritance from his parents, and that you had agreed to divorce. Had I known the truth, I would never have gotten involved. I am ending our relationship effective immediately." Michael read it over my shoulder and muttered, "Rats and sinking ships." When I asked if I should respond, he advised, "Absolutely not. Forward it to Diane and add it to the file. Jessica might be trying to position herself as an unwitting victim here." The next morning brought more news from our forensic accountant. Francis had attempted multiple logins overnight, trying different passwords, even changing the recovery email addresses. Each attempt had been logged and reported to the court. "He's digging himself deeper," Diane explained during our morning call. Later, we learned that Francis had called our real estate agent, demanding the beach house sale proceed despite the court order. The agent, already aware of the situation, recorded the call and sent it directly to Diane. "This demonstrates his intent to violate the court's orders even after being formally notified," Diane noted. Then came more calls from Francis. The court scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday, and his passport had been flagged so he'd be detained if he tried to leave the country. "Your passport is flagged, Francis. Make arrangements to return it," I said calmly. The panic in his voice was palpable as he asked, "Flagged? What does that mean?" I explained, "It means you can leave Bali. But when you try to enter any country other than the United States, you'll be detained. The judge is concerned you might attempt to disappear with our marital assets." In the midst of a muffled argument, Jessica's voice rising in both volume and pitch, I informed him that I'd emailed all the court documents to him. Diane had suggested I also copy his brother Michael, since he is an attorney. Michael, who had called me that morning, was furious, he said. "Dad would be ashamed." Francis's voice finally shifted, desperation replacing anger as he pleaded. "We can work something out. We will, through the proper legal channels." I replied coolly, "I suggest you find a good attorney. And Francis, the children know everything. They've seen the evidence and read your texts." For the next 48 hours, it unfolded like a slow-motion car crash that I watched from a safe distance. Francis continued to try calling, but I answered only once more to direct all further communication to our attorneys. Michael arrived and reassured me that everything was being documented. Later that day, our forensic accountant reported that Francis had made several attempts to access our accounts overnight. Each one logged meticulously. The judge, Diane, and Michael all agreed. The more he tried to bypass the order, the stronger our case became. By the end of the day, my phone buzzed with another email from Jessica, again from Mrs. Mercer. I forwarded it to Diane without comment. It was clear she was now positioning herself as a victim of deception. Throughout that tumultuous period, our children, Thomas and Elise, ages 27 and 24, already knew what was happening. I had sat them down days ago to explain their father's betrayal and the legal steps I was taking. Their pain was evident, but they understood betrayal all too well. Now, as I sit at my desk, making a cup of tea and reviewing the folder labeled Francis documentation, I know that the long night of reckoning is nearly over. I have a secure paper trail and a court order protecting our family's financial future. Francis's last-ditch attempts to salvage his plan, using offshore accounts and secret transfers, have all been intercepted. This is my new beginning, forged from decades of hard work, careful planning, and an unwavering commitment to protect what is rightfully mine. As I watch the blue light of my phone fade, I feel a mix of sorrow, resolve, and ultimately liberation. My 30-year marriage is over, and while the betrayal stings deeply, I have reclaimed control of our shared future. I will rebuild my life, protect my children's inheritance, and finally live free from deceit. And as for Francis, his paradise in Bali has turned into a prison of his own making. My husband's text came in at 3:17 a.m. in our Boston brownstone. The blue light of my phone revealed his message from Bali. Sold our Cape Cod beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless, LOL. Don't bother calling, changing my number tomorrow. After 30 years of marriage, that was his goodbye. A text punctuated with a mocking LOL. I simply replied, check your account balance. My name is Alice Mercer, and at 52 I never expected to start over. Yet, over the past months I had sensed something was amiss. Francis's sudden obsession with fitness, joining an exclusive gym, disappearing for 2-hour sessions 3 times a week, then daily, had been the first sign. He'd lost 30 pounds, and whenever I questioned the rising credit card charges, he snapped, you should be happy for me. I'm finally taking care of myself. Then came the secretive password changes on our financial accounts, mysterious phone calls, and business trips that matched his trainer Jessica's Instagram posts. Instead of confronting him directly, I began meticulously gathering evidence. I documented every unusual expense. Weekly $500 charges at Elite Training Solutions, random cash withdrawals of $2,000, then $3,000, each just below the bank's notification threshold. I consulted Diane, our family attorney, and even hired a forensic accountant who discovered Francis had opened a separate bank account 3 months earlier. The final, damning evidence was found in draft emails to a real estate agent about quietly listing our family's beach house, a property that had been in our family for generations. The turning point came when I overheard Francis speaking on the phone, using that intimate tone he once reserved for me, as he said, Jessica, baby, it's all coming together. The beach house should sell quickly. Once that money hits our account, I'll transfer everything to our offshore account. By the time she figures it out, we'll be living the dream in Bali. That night, I gathered every piece of evidence and took them to Judge Martinez. Within weeks, an emergency asset protection order was granted, freezing all our joint assets and intercepting any large transfers. A few days later, I received a notification on our banking app. Someone was trying to access our account from an international IP address. Francis was finally checking his balance. 15 minutes later, his number flashed on my screen. True to form, he hadn't changed his number. I let it ring a few times, then answered. Alice, what the hell did you do? His voice was a mix of rage and panic, the sound of his paradise beginning to crumble. Good morning, Francis, I replied calmly. I see you checked your accounts. This is our money. You had no right to, he shouted. Our 30-year marriage money is mine to use. I interrupted. Our money, we saved it together for our retirement and our children's future. I'll fight this, he threatened, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I could almost picture him stepping away from Jessica, desperate to hide the disaster he'd orchestrated. You won't get away with this, I said. I've already protected what's legally mine. I reminded him, Judge Martinez has the record of you saying, leave Alice with nothing while we live it up in Bali. And by the way, the beach house transaction has been voided. In the background, I heard a female voice growing agitated. Is that Jessica? I pressed. Tell her the offshore account you set up has been frozen and the authorities have been notified about potential tax evasion. Desperation replaced his anger. No, I've been protecting myself from your calculated betrayal, he stammered. There's a difference, I replied coldly. Also, the children know everything. They've seen the evidence and read your texts. Over the next 48 hours, Francis tried calling 17 more times. I answered only once more to direct all further communications to our attorneys. His brother Michael eventually arrived at my home, bringing a stack of new documents. Alice, he said, we've just received notification that Francis has booked a flight back to Boston. He lands tomorrow evening. I felt a complicated mix of relief, anxiety, and vindication. I was finally going to see him face the consequences. Michael slid a paper across the table. He's claiming that the text was a joke, a misunderstanding about the beach house listing. Can you believe that? My voice rose in disbelief. After all the evidence, he now calls it a joke? Francis's return to Boston was set to play out like a carefully orchestrated legal ballet. Diane had arranged for a court officer to serve him with papers as soon as he cleared customs at Logan International Airport. Michael's colleague sent us live updates from the terminal. As we gathered in Diane's office, Michael reported, "He just arrived." I maintained my composure as I recalled how, after 30 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to Francis's predictable pattern: denial, bargaining, misdirected anger, and finally tearful pleas for forgiveness. "Alice," Diane asked gently, "are you absolutely certain you want to be present at tomorrow's hearing? You could let me represent you." "I need to be there," I replied firmly, not for Francis but for myself. For too long I had been invisible, accommodating his needs and dreams at the expense of my own. Our children, Thomas and Elise, had insisted on joining me, forming a united front as we navigated this painful chapter. 2 hours later, Francis's new attorney, Gregory Powell, called Diane. He wanted an emergency meeting, a last-minute attempt to negotiate. "They're offering a settlement," Diane explained. "Francis is willing to let you keep the beach house if you drop the emergency orders and agree to a quick, quiet divorce." I nearly laughed in disbelief. "The beach house? That property has been in our family for 4 generations. "It's not a serious offer," Diane said. "They're fishing to see what you might accept." "Tell them we'll see them in court," I stated firmly. That evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang with a call from Michael. "Alice, I'm with Francis," he said tensely on speakerphone. "He wants to speak with you before tomorrow's hearing." I took a deep breath and Michael put me on speaker. Francis's voice sounded rough and defeated. "Alice, I made a terrible mistake." What mistake exactly?" I asked calmly. "I tried to steal our savings, attempted to sell our family's beach house, and texted you to enjoy being homeless." "I wasn't thinking clearly," he stammered. Then in a desperate tone he added, "Jessica, she made everything seem possible, a fresh start. But now she's gone." I replied dryly, "I want to come home." His voice broke. "We can work something out, we will, through the proper legal channels." I said, "I suggest you find a good attorney. And Francis, the children know everything. They've seen the evidence and read your texts." After that call, Francis's further attempts were redirected to Diane's office. The next morning, in the imposing courthouse with its polished marble and echoing halls, I sat at the plaintiff's table alongside Diane. My children, Thomas and Elise, sat directly behind me. Michael positioned himself between our table and where Francis would soon be seated, a silent statement of divided loyalties but ultimate support for the truth. When Francis finally entered with his attorney, he looked haggard and diminished. The confident, tanned man who had left for Bali 3 weeks ago was a shadow of himself. He tried to catch my eye, but I kept my gaze forward as Judge Martinez entered. "We are here in the case of Mercer versus Mercer," she began, reviewing the documentation. "Temporary asset protection orders were issued 3 weeks ago, in response to evidence of attempted fraud and financial abandonment." Gregory Powell, Francis's attorney, launched into a defense. "Your Honor, my client wishes to assert that the text message was sent in poor judgment. A joke, really." Judge Martinez cut him off sharply. "Mr. Powell, I have reviewed extensive documentation, including recorded conversations, email drafts about the unauthorized sale of jointly owned property, and multiple attempts to access frozen accounts. Your client's explanations are implausible." The forensic accountant then presented his findings. Francis had systematically withdrawn nearly $887,000 in small amounts over 4 months. A video testimony from our real estate agent confirmed that Francis had secretly instructed her to list the beach house without my knowledge. The most damning evidence came from Francis's own devices: emails, offshore account setups, and recorded conversations where he mentioned leaving Alice with nothing while we live it up in Bali. When Francis finally took the stand, he attempted contrition. "I made a terrible mistake, a midlife crisis really. I never intended to leave my wife destitute," he pleaded. But Judge Martinez's gaze was unyielding. "Your text message said, 'Enjoy being homeless, LOL. Your actions were not accidental.'" After 3 grueling hours, Judge Martinez delivered her ruling. The court finds overwhelming evidence of attempted fraud and financial abandonment. The temporary orders freezing all marital assets shall remain in place pending final divorce proceedings. Additionally, Mr. Mercer is held in contempt for his attempts to circumvent these orders. His passport is to be surrendered, and Mrs. Mercer's petition for exclusive use of our Boston home and the Cape Cod beach house is granted. Mr. Mercer is to pay all legal fees incurred by Mrs. Mercer. That evening, as I prepared for bed in our now secure Boston brownstone, my phone buzzed with one final message from Michael. "Alice, Dad's found an apartment. I start my new job at the community college next week." I nodded silently, a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow settling over me. 6 months after the hearing, I sat on the deck of the Cape Cod beach house as the October sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, ending our 30-year marriage with a single stroke of a judge's pen. The final settlement was fair but firm. I was awarded the beach house outright, along with 70% of our retirement funds and investments, securing our children's future. Francis received the smaller of our 2 cars, a modest sum in liquid assets for housing, and was ordered to pay my legal fees in full. That evening, as the sea breeze gently tousled my hair, a neighbor approached and whispered, "Thanks, sweetheart," handing me a steaming mug of tea. Later, Uncle Michael called to say that Dad had found a modest apartment and would start his new job at the community college next week. I listened quietly. Francis, on the other hand, had lost his executive position. His former company disavowed him after the scandal, and his reputation lay in ruins. My daughter Elise asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" I replied, "I am," even though the pain of betrayal still ached inside me. I never wanted Francis to suffer. I only wanted to protect what was rightfully ours. A year later, I stood at the podium in Boston University's conference center, addressing over 200 people, mostly women who had faced similar financial betrayal. Preparation isn't paranoia, I told them. Documentation isn't distrust, it's self-protection. My case had been covered by the Boston Globe, and many women reached out with their own stories of financial abuse. That prompted me to work with Diane and other experts to create a workshop series, Financial Security After Betrayal. In the front row, my children Thomas and Elise sat proudly, and Uncle Michael, my steadfast ally, stood by my side. An older woman approached after the event and said, "My husband of 42 is planning something similar. Thanks to you. I've already contacted an attorney and documented everything." Her words validated the pain, the public exposure, and the difficult decisions I had made. What Francis intended as my destruction had instead become the foundation for my strength. Driving home along the familiar coastal route to Cape Cod that evening, I felt a profound sense of peace, a strength I never knew I possessed. While Francis had lost nearly everything, I had gained something far more precious, the clarity and courage to build a life on my own terms. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't revenge, it's resilience. As the waves gently lapped the shore, I realized that one chapter had ended, and another, filled with possibility, was only just beginning. My future, now unbound by betrayal, shone brighter than ever before.